everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the structural and functional classifications of neurons. If you have not already watched the divisions of the nervous system, please go back and watch that video first and then come back here. And remember, we're going to be using this piece of paper that you made in that video for this one. Okay, so first we have to talk about the structure of a neuron. And most people are familiar with something that looks like this. And what we have to remember is that a neuron works in one direction. It's a one-way street. So information or signals come in on one end, they work their way down the neuron, and then signals are going to leave the neuron at the opposite end. So they never go that direction. They're always coming this direction. So the part of the neuron that receives incoming signals are the dendrites. You can see there's lots and lots of little projections coming out here, and these are all the dendrites that are going to receive any incoming signals. Another important part of the neuron is the cell body. This is also sometimes called the soma. And this is the area of the neuron where all the general cell stuff happens. This is where the nucleus is. This is where the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum are, where the cytoplasm is. All that stuff is still in a neuron. It's just been sort of squeezed so it's long. So you can see the cell body right here. It contains the nucleus. Now, just before the beginning of the axon, we have an area called the axon hillock. This is an area that's really important when we're generating an action potential. This is where a lot of the voltage-gated channels are. The long, thin projection coming off here is called the axon, and this is the area that's going to propagate the action potential. At the far end of the neuron is the axon terminal. It contains the synaptic end bulbs, and you can see in this particular neuron that there's a lot of splitting and branching of the axon terminal into multiple different synaptic end bulbs. And of course, we've already learned in the muscular system that those synaptic end bulbs are going to synapse with something that comes after the neuron. In the case of the skeletal system, we learned that there were muscle fibers that it would synapse with. But sometimes these neurons are going to synapse with other things like glandular epithelium or perhaps even another neuron. Now you might also notice that there's sort of some shiny looking pink cells wrapped around the axon. Those are called Schwann cells. Schwann cells make up the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath is something that helps to insulate this axon so that action potentials can move much quicker through a myelinated axon than one that's unmyelinated. So in this particular picture, it shows Schwann cells, which create the myelin sheath in the PNS. There's a different type of cell that creates a myelin sheath within the CNS. And remember, the PNS is the peripheral nervous system, and the CNS is the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. In between the Schwann cells is a little area that is unmyelinated, and that's called a node of Ranvier. So that's an unmyelinated area. And just like muscle cells had special words for simple parts of the cell, so does a neuron. So the axolemma is simply the plasma membrane of a neuron. And the axoplasm is basically the cytoplasm of a neuron. Okay, now we know all of the different parts of the neuron. Let's talk about the structural classification of different neurons. So there's three different ways that we can structurally classify neurons, and they're based on how many projections are coming off the cell body. In this neuron that we looked at, you can see here's the cell body, and here's lots and lots and lots of projections coming off that. So we call a neuron that looks like this a multipolar neuron. And in fact, you can see it right here. This is the one that most people are most familiar with. Their dendrites are at the end, the cell body is at the receiving end, and there's a long axon and then axon terminal. If you look at the next neuron over, you can see the cell body is kind of in the middle of the neuron, and it has 1, 2 projections coming off of it. 1, 2. So the signals still come in on the dendrites, but then they have a long projection until the cell body. And the axon only is the part between the cell body and the terminal ends. So because there are 2 projections here, we call this a bipolar neuron. The third kind, you can see the cell body is here, and it literally just has 1 tiny little projection coming off of it. We're still going in a one-directional world here. Signals come in on the dendrites and leave on the terminal ends, but in this case, the cell body is kind of out of the loop. And this is called a unipolar neuron because there's only 1 projection. So that's the structural classification. The functional classification is what kind of information does it carry. So we're going to come back to this messy piece of paper, which was from our last video, the divisions of the nervous system. The best part is that I've already told you about the functional characteristics of neurons. It basically means what type of information do neurons carry. So remember, we have sensory information going from the PNS to the CNS, and we have motor information coming out from the CNS back to the PNS. So motor neurons are ones that are carrying information going from the CNS to the PNS, and sensory neurons are ones that are going from the PNS to the CNS. So let's put these 2 concepts together. We talked about multipolar neurons. They're actually over here on the motor neuron side. So they're going to have their dendrites in the CNS, and their cell body is part of the CNS as well. And then the long axon is going to leave the CNS and come out here, and they're going to stimulate the effectors. So they're going this way, and this is a multipolar neuron. Going in on the sensory side, we actually have 2 different types of neurons that we are worried about. One of them is coming from the somatic senses. So remember, somatic senses are general body senses: touch, vibration, temperature, stomach ache, pounding heart, whatever. All of those senses are part of your general body senses. So those somatic senses are actually going to be carried on a unipolar neuron. And that neuron is going to take information in on the dendrites from the general body, going to bring it in and give it to the CNS. So that's a unipolar neuron that's going to carry sensory information from the somatic senses. The special senses are a little bit more special. They're going to pick up sight or hearing or sense of taste or sense of smell, and it's going to be carried into the CNS in a bipolar neuron. And that information is going to be given to the CNS in that manner. So this is bipolar. Multipolar neuron is out here. Now you might notice there's a gap here. So what's going to take information from the sensory neurons and give it to the motor neurons? Well, it's a very special kind of neuron, and it's called an interneuron. And an interneuron is also a multipolar neuron. And it's going to receive all of the incoming signals from various places, and it's going to sum up all that information and give that information and give some kind of direction to the motor neurons. So let's write down a couple things we know about interneurons. So first of all, interneurons are going to bridge the gap. And this is going to bridge the gap between sensory and motor. We also know that these are going to be multipolar neurons. They're going to do something called integration. It's a really important word. Integration is essentially summing up all these signals that are coming in from the sensory system and making a decision about whether to send a signal on to the motor. And the last thing that's important about an interneuron is they're only within the CNS. So they do not come out into the periphery. So let's take a quick look at this. We have our sensory information, which is bringing in stuff. And we know that that's either going to be unipolar neurons or bipolar neurons. And remember, unipolar are our somatic senses and bipolar are our special senses. We know our motor division are going to be multipolar neurons. And in the middle here, we have integration. And remember, integration is the summing up of all received signals. And that's where our interneurons are. And you can see this right here is an interneuron. It's only in the CNS. Here's the PNS. Sensory division brings information from the PNS to the CNS. Motor division brings directions from the CNS back to the PNS. And the interneurons are only here in the CNS. So if I were to draw this out, I would start with a green pen because that's what I've been using for sensory. So we have our dendrites at one end, and let's just call this a unipolar neuron. And it's going to bring in information to the PNS. Now, it's not the only neuron that's coming in here. There's lots of neurons that are going to be bringing information in. And all of them are going to be giving information to our interneuron, which is then going to take that information, make some decision about it, and give that information to a motor neuron, which is going to bring it out to one of the effectors. So let's do a quick review of structural and functional types of neurons. We have, under structural, we have unipolar, one projection, bipolar, two projections, or multipolar, more than two projections. We also have functional categories. And remember, functional categories are what kind of signals they're carrying. So we have sensory information, which are also often called afferent. We have interneurons, which we know are very special. We know a lot of stuff about them. They're going to bridge the gap. They're multipolar. Their job is to integrate or sum up all the signals received, and they're only inside the CNS. And we also have motor neurons, which are often called efferent neurons. So how are these all relating to each other? Well, remember, our sensory neurons are bringing stuff in, bringing in information from the PNS to the CNS. And some of them are unipolar, and these are your somatic senses. Some of the sensory neurons are structurally bipolar, and those are the ones that are special senses. So we have two different types of sensory neurons that can be coming in from the PNS to the CNS. Now, what do we know about interneurons? Interneurons are always multipolar, but interneurons are wholly within the CNS, so they don't have any parts outside. Motor neurons are also always multipolar, and these are going to be our two divisions: autonomic, which is our involuntary, and somatic, which is our general body or our skeletal muscles. So two types of structural neurons carry sensory, and only one type of structural neuron carries both, is being carried by both interneurons and motor neurons. All right, I think that's it for today. See you in class.